wind had teeth. It bit at Clara's exposed skin, a relentless predator tasting the last of her strength. It was a wind born in the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the West. And it carried the grit of the land itself, a fine red dust that stained the hem of her worn dress, settled in the lines of her face, and coated her throat until every swallow was an act of grim determination. The sun, a bloated, bloody orange, was dying behind the jagged peaks in the distance, smearing the bruised purple sky with its final, desperate light. This was the twilight of 1885, a world stripped bare to bone and rock. Each step was a negotiation with collapse. Her boots, thin-soled and cracked, offered little protection from the sharp stones of the wagon trail. Her shoulders ached from a hunger that had long since moved past noise and settled into a deep, hollow silence in her belly. She had been walking for 2 days, fueled by a fear more potent than any food. Fear had a bitter taste, but it kept a person moving. She was running from the town of redemption, a name so steeped in irony it felt like a curse. There had been no redemption for her there, only judgment. It had started with the whispers, faint as the rustle of snakes in dry grass. They called her the Yankee nurse, the woman who had tended to the bluebellies during the war, in a town still nursing its Confederate wounds. Her past was a sin she could not wash away. The women clutched their children closer when she passed, their gazes like stones. The men looked at her with a different kind of speculation, a mixture of contempt and a crude curiosity that made her skin crawl. The whispers had been tolerable, the loneliness, a familiar ache, but then had come Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor of the mercantile where she'd found work sweeping floors and stocking shelves. He was a man whose piety was as thin as his lips, a veneer for the rot beneath. He began with small things, a hand that lingered too long on her arm, a compliment on her form that felt like a brand. Last week, he had cornered her in the storeroom, the air thick with the smell of burlap and cured meats. His breath, sour with whiskey, had been hot on her cheek as he'd told her what a lonely widow like herself needed, what a man like him was owed for his charity in hiring her. He hadn't laid a hand on her, not then, but the threat was there, coiled and venomous in his eyes. He had given her until the end of the week to be more grateful. That night, she had packed the little she owned, a spare dress, a faded photograph of a face she tried daily to remember, and the few dollars she had saved, and slipped out of town before dawn. She chose the desolate northern trail, a path few traveled, hoping to lose herself in the vastness before Abernathy discovered her gone and decided to pursue his property. Now, that desperate flight was nearing its end. The world was tilting, the horizon blurring at the edges. Thirst was a fire in her throat, just as she felt her knees begin to buckle, a final prayer dying on her lips. She saw it, through the swirling haze of dust, a smudge against the landscape, a structure. It was little more than a dilapidated cabin with a sway-backed barn, looking as weary and broken as she felt. But from its stone chimney, a thin, gray ribbon of smoke curled into the darkening sky. Life. The sight sent a jolt through her, a current of pure, animal instinct. It was a chance, a slim, dangerous, unknown chance, but a chance nonetheless. With the last dregs of her will, she veered off the trail, her feet sinking into the sandy earth as she stumbled toward the flickering promise of shelter. The closer she got, the more forbidding the place looked. The fences were in disrepair, sections of split rail collapsing into the dust. The cabin itself was made of dark, weathered logs, chinked with mud that was crumbling away. It looked like a place the world had forgotten, a monument to solitude, a part of her, the sensible part that had been eroded by days of hardship, screamed at her to turn back. A lone cabin in the middle of nowhere could hold dangers worse than any storm, but the wind was howling now, carrying the first icy sting of snow, and her body could not obey the warnings of her mind. She was 20 feet from the porch when the cabin door scraped open with a sound like grinding bones. A man emerged, a silhouette against the faint light from within. He was tall and broad, filling the doorway, and in his hands, held with a casual but unmistakable familiarity, was a long-barreled shotgun. Clara froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The air crackled with a sudden, sharp tension. He didn't move for a long moment, simply watching her, his face obscured by the twilight gloom. She could see enough to know he was no old man. The set of his shoulders was hard, the stillness in his stance one of readiness. "That's far enough," he said. His voice was a low growl, rough and unused, the sound of rocks scraping together. It was not a voice that knew kindness. She couldn't speak, her throat too dry. She raised a trembling hand, a gesture of peace, of supplication. "Please, the storm." He took a step forward, out of the shadows of the doorway, and she saw his face. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape of its own, all sharp angles and sun-beaten skin. A thick, faded scar ran from the corner of his left eye down across his cheek to his jawline, a pale, jagged line that pulled his mouth into a permanent, slight snarl. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were narrowed with a suspicion so profound it felt like a physical force. They swept over her, taking in her torn dress, her dusty form, her desperation. He saw it all, and it did not soften him. He was assessing her, the way a wolf assesses a wounded deer, not with pity, but with a cold calculation of risk. She was a threat, a disruption, another person in his self-imposed exile. The first snowflake struck her cheek, melting instantly. A cold shock against her feverish skin. Then another, and another. The wind shrieked, whipping her hair across her face. The temperature was dropping with alarming speed. To be caught in the open now would be a death sentence. They both knew it. His gaze flickered from her to the roiling sky, then back. The shotgun didn't waver. He seemed to be weighing the trouble she would bring against the trouble of finding a frozen corpse on his land in the morning. The corpse, apparently, was the greater inconvenience. He gave a sharp, impatient jerk of his head toward the open door. "Get inside, widow!" he barked. The word struck her. Widow. He didn't know her, yet he had named her. It was a label, a dismissal. He wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing a category of trouble. Yet the command was her salvation. It was not an invitation, but an order she would gladly obey. Clara stumbled forward, her legs wooden and clumsy. She climbed the 2 rickety steps to the porch, her body shaking uncontrollably now, a combination of cold, relief, and terror. As she passed him to enter the cabin, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of wood smoke, leather, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood and solitude. The inside of the cabin was a single room, larger than she expected, but stark and bare. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within, its flames casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn wooden floor. The warmth washed over her, and it was so intensely welcome that she felt dizzy. A crude table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A bed, covered with a pile of furs, was tucked into a far corner. The air was thick with the smell of dust and disuse. Everything was coated in a thin layer of it, as if the owner couldn't be bothered to fight back the encroaching wilderness. It was a shelter, not a home. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into a deeper gloom, lit only by the fire. The sound made her jump. He bolted it with a heavy thud of wood on wood. Trapped. The thought was immediate and chilling. He moved past her to the hearth, placing the shotgun on a pair of pegs mounted on the wall above the mantelpiece. He didn't look at her, but she could feel his awareness of her, a tense, coiled energy that filled the small space. "I'm not running a charity," he said, his back still to her. "You can have the floor by the fire for one night. Come morning, you're gone." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a reedy rasp. She hugged her arms around herself, trying to stop the tremors that racked her body. He finally turned to face her, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The firelight flickered across his scarred face, making the shadows deeper, the angles sharper. His eyes were cold and assessing. "You'll earn your keep. There's a stew on the stove. You can finish it. After, you'll clean up. The place needs it." It was another order. She looked past him and saw a small cast-iron stove in the corner, a pot sitting on top. It was a test, a way for him to establish the terms of her presence. She was not a guest. She was a stray he had allowed in from the storm, and she would work for her shelter. "Of course," she said, her voice a little stronger. Survival meant being useful. She had learned that long ago in the bloody, chaotic tents of the field hospitals. "What's your name?" he demanded. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her full name, Clara May Thompson, felt like a link to the past she was fleeing, to the town that had scorned her, to the life that had been stripped away from her. It felt too heavy to carry into this room. "Clara," she said, offering only the piece of it that still felt like her own. She did not elaborate. She did not mention where she had come from or where she was going. Her history was a dangerous burden, one she would not share with this hard, watchful man. He grunted, a sound of acknowledgement, not approval. "I'm Eli." He offered nothing else, and she did not ask. The silence stretched between them, thick with suspicion and the howling of the wind outside. The storm had arrived in full force, rattling the single window pane and screaming down the chimney. In this small, dusty cabin, two strangers, both prisoners of their pasts, were now prisoners of the snow, bound together by a fire and the fragile, unspoken contract of a single night's survival. The first days were a silent truce, governed by the storm that raged outside and the unspoken rules within the cabin's four walls. The world had been erased by a blizzard of impossible fury, a swirling vortex of white that buried the fences, smothered the landscape, and sealed them in a shared tomb of quiet hostility. Eli moved with a heavy, deliberate economy, his presence a constant, brooding weight. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. "Stoke the fire. Melt more snow. The wood's low." Clara answered with work. Work was a language she understood, a penance and a prayer. She scrubbed the grime from the floorboards until the pale grain of the wood began to show. She took Eli's coarse, smoke-scented shirts and trousers down to the hearth, washing them in a bucket of heated snowmelt until her knuckles were raw, the scent of lye soap a sharp, clean defiance against the cabin's masculine musk. She found his mending basket, a neglected tangle of thread and torn fabric, and set about restoring his clothes with the small, precise stitches she had once used to close the wounds of dying men. Her labor was a shield, a way to make herself solid and real, to earn the space she occupied. Eli watched her. He would sit at the table, cleaning his rifle or sharpening a knife, his gaze occasionally drifting to her, cold and unreadable. He watched her move, her actions efficient and devoid of wasted motion. He noted the way she banked the fire at night to conserve wood, the way she could make a thin stew of salted pork and dried beans taste like something more than mere sustenance. This was not the helplessness he expected from a woman alone and on the run. There was a competence to her, a resilience in the straight line of her back that unsettled him. The moment of jarring recognition came on the third evening. The storm had momentarily subsided, and the cold had deepened, cracking the timbers of the cabin like gunshots. Eli had stripped off his shirt to wash from a basin of hot water by the fire. His back was a road map of old scars, but it was when he turned that Clara's breath caught in her throat. There, on the left side of his chest, just over his heart, was the wound. She knew it instantly. It was a puckered, angry starburst of tissue, the ghost of a hole made by a mini-ball. Time had faded its color, but she recognized its geography with a certainty that stole the air from her lungs. She could feel the phantom weight of a young soldier's body under her hands, smell the cloying, metallic scent of blood and swamp fever. She remembered the tent, suffocatingly hot. The low moans of the dying, a constant chorus. She remembered a boy, no older than 20, his face pale with shock, his eyes wide with the terror of his own mortality. She had packed his wound, her fingers working deftly to stop the bleeding. Her voice a low murmur of encouragement she didn't feel. He had gripped her hand, his grasp surprisingly strong, and held on as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. She had thought him lost, another nameless face swallowed by the war's insatiable appetite. And here he was, Eli. The gruff, scarred man with winter in his eyes was the boy she had pulled back from the precipice of death. The irony was a bitter pill. She had saved him, and now he was, in his own grudging way, saving her. He didn't recognize her, of course. To him, she had been just a face in a fever dream, an angel of mercy in a canvas hell. Now, she was just widow, a nameless piece of trouble the storm had blown to his door. She quickly looked down at the shirt she was mending, her needle suddenly heavy in her trembling hand. To reveal herself would be to hand him a weapon, to give him a past she had no right to. Her own history was dangerous enough. Sharing his could be fatal. The wilderness pressed in on them, a constant, menacing presence. The snow fell for 6 straight days, piling in great drifts against the cabin door, shrinking their world to the confines of the single room. At night, the howling of wolves echoed across the frozen expanse, a lonely, predatory sound that made the warmth of the fire feel fragile and precious. One morning, a commotion from the chicken coop sent Eli storming out with his shotgun. A family of weasels had gotten in, leaving a bloody trail of feathers and carnage. Clara followed him out, her shawl pulled tight against the biting cold. She expected him to curse her, to blame her for the unlocked latch. Instead, he simply handed her the lantern. "Hold it steady," he'd grunted, together, in the frigid pre-dawn gloom. They had repaired the damaged wire and secured the door, their hands brushing in the tight space. He had looked at her then, a flicker of something, not gratitude, perhaps, but a grudging acknowledgement of her use, in his eyes before the mask of indifference slammed back down. He was beginning to see her not as an intruder, but as a part of the grim ecosystem of survival. She kept his house in order, and for a man who lived on the edge of chaos, that order was a small, significant comfort. Her own past, however, could not be so easily ordered. One afternoon, while Eli was out checking his traps, she allowed herself a moment of weakness. She retrieved the worn, folded letter from her satchel. It was not a letter she had received, but one she was writing, a letter that would never be sent. She smoothed it out on her lap, her fingers tracing the words she had written to the daughter she barely knew. Asterisk, my dearest Lily. Asterisk. Today you are 6 years old. I picture you with your father's dark hair and, I hope, a smile that is all your own. The world is covered in snow here. It is beautiful and clean, and it makes me think of you, of the purity I was forced to leave behind. She had been a young widow then, her husband lost at Gettysburg, when she'd had Lily, her late husband's family. Stern and unforgiving, had seen the child as a burden and Clara as a stain on their name. They had given her a choice: give up the child to be raised by a proper family, or be cast out with nothing, condemning them both to starvation. She had made an impossible choice, tearing out a piece of her own soul to ensure her daughter would eat and have a roof over her head. The memory was a fresh wound, and as she sat by the fire, a single tear escaped and splattered onto the page, smudging the ink, then another, and another, until her shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. She didn't hear Eli return. The first she knew of his presence was the sudden drop in temperature as the door opened. She quickly folded the letter, her back to him, and scrubbed at her eyes with the heel of her hand. He stood there for a long moment, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of snow falling from his boots. She could feel his gaze on her back, But he said nothing. He simply moved to the other side of the hearth, hung up his coat, and began to clean his traps, the metallic scrape and click a punctuation mark to the thick, uncomfortable silence. The fragile peace between them shattered 2 days later. The larder was running low, and Clara, searching for a sack of flour she thought she'd seen, wandered toward a heavy canvas curtain that sectioned off a corner of the cabin. It served as his storage area, a place she had instinctively avoided, assuming it held nothing more than dry goods. She pulled the curtain aside. The space was a small arsenal. 2 rifles were mounted on the wall, alongside a pair of pistols. Boxes of ammunition were stacked neatly on a shelf. Below them, leaning against the wall, was a dusty Union Army rucksack. "Get out of there!" Eli's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a whip crack. She turned, startled, to see him standing not 10 feet away, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His eyes, usually just cold, were now blazing with a raw, visceral anger that made her take a step back. "I was just looking for the flour," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I don't care what you were looking for," he snarled, advancing on her. "That is my space. You don't go there. Ever." His reaction was far out of proportion to her simple mistake. This wasn't just about privacy. It was fear. She saw it lurking beneath the rage. He was afraid of what she might see, what she might understand. He was afraid of the rucksack, of the uniform it likely contained, of the story it told about a soldier who had walked away from the war before it was over. His wound, his secret, was hidden there. Something inside her, worn thin by days of silent deference and years of being trampled upon, finally snapped. She did not cower. She did not apologize. She stood her ground, her chin lifted, and met his furious gaze with a quiet fire of her own. "You have given me rules for this house," she said, her voice low but clear. "I have followed every one of them. I have cooked your food, mended your clothes, and kept your fire. I have earned my place by this hearth. If you want to keep secrets, then hang a door, not a curtain." He stopped, stunned into silence by her defiance. He was used to women who flinched, who deferred. He had expected her to stammer an apology and scurry away. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding strength. For the first time, they were not a man and a stray, a master and a servant. They were equals, 2 jagged, broken pieces of the same war, locked in a battle of wills. His anger warred with a shocking, unfamiliar surge of respect. Their eyes held for a long, charged moment. The air vibrated with unspoken things, his shame, her resilience, their shared history of violence and survival. In his gaze, she saw the cornered desperation of a man haunted by his past. In her eyes, he saw a strength he had never known, a defiance that was not born of pride, but of an unbreakable will to simply endure. It was more than anger that passed between them. It was a flash of raw, unfiltered recognition. He finally broke the gaze, turning away with a curse under his breath. The fight was over, but the tension remained, a living thing in the small cabin. That night, sleep would not come for Eli. He lay on his bunk, staring into the darkness. The image of her face, calm and defiant, burned into his mind. The silence of the cabin was different now, heavier, and through it, he could hear a faint sound from the other side of the room, from the small pile of blankets where she slept by the dying embers of the fire. It was the sound of quiet, heartbroken weeping. A part of him, the hard, solitary part that had kept him alive, screamed at him to ignore it. It was not his concern. She was not his concern, but another, deeper part, a part he thought had died on a battlefield in the Virginia mud. Listened. He heard her pain, her loneliness, her sorrow, and it echoed in the vast, empty chambers of his own heart. He did nothing. He did not go to her. He did not offer a single word of comfort, but he lay awake for hours, listening to her cry, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel entirely alone. The great blizzard had broken, leaving the world in a state of fragile truce. A weak sun, a stranger in the sky, cast a pale, watery light over the snow-drowned landscape. The air was sharp and clean, but the ground was treacherous. A thin layer of melting snow concealed sheets of black ice, turning the familiar terrain into a series of hidden traps. It was in this new, glistening world that the wall of ice between them first cracked. Eli was leading his weary horse, a big roan gelding, from the meager warmth of the barn. He moved with the thoughtless confidence of a man who knew every inch of his land. He failed to see the slick, dark patch beneath a dusting of fresh powder. His boots shot out from under him, and for a moment he seemed to hang in the air, a caricature of surprise, before his full weight came down with a sickening thud. He landed hard on his back, the air exploding from his lungs in a sharp grunt of pain. The horse shied, pulling back with a nervous snort. Clara was on the porch, shaking a dusty rug, when she saw him fall. For a split second, she was frozen, watching the man who had been her gruff, intimidating jailer lie helpless in the snow. Then, instinct took over, not the instinct of a woman, but the instinct of a nurse. She dropped the rug and was moving before she'd made a conscious decision, her skirts kicking up snow as she ran to him. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice crisp and authoritative. The voice she had used in field hospitals filled with screaming men. Eli glared up at her, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "I'm fine," he growled, already trying to push himself up on his elbows. A sharp wince of pain betrayed the lie. "You're an idiot if you try to stand on that leg too fast," she retorted, kneeling beside him in the wet snow. "Give me your arm." He hesitated, his pride warring with the pain shooting up from his twisted ankle. But there was a no-nonsense command in her eyes he found himself unable to defy. Grudgingly, he extended his arm. She took it, her grip firm and sure, and as her hands closed around his forearm to brace him, he felt them. They were not the hands he had imagined. He had expected the soft, smooth skin of a town woman, or the chapped, delicate hands of a lady fallen on hard times. These were not those hands. Her palms were calloused, the skin thickened from hard labor. Her fingers were strong, her grip steady and powerful. They were the hands of a woman who had worked, who had struggled, who had held on. In that single, startling moment of contact, his entire perception of her shifted. This was not a fragile, helpless widow who had stumbled into his life. This was something else entirely. With her help, he managed to get to his feet, leaning heavily on her as he tested his weight. The sharp, physical reality of her strength was a profound shock, a quiet revelation in the cold morning air. That fall, and the capable hands that had lifted him, changed the quality of the silence between them. It was no longer a heavy, suspicious quiet, but something more contemplative. The conversation started in fragments, tossed into the air like kindling for a reluctant fire. While she restacked the wood pile, he found a reason to be nearby, mending a piece of tack. "You seem to know your way around an injury," he remarked one afternoon, his voice carefully casual. Clara didn't look up from her work. "I saw my share of them. During the war." She chose her words with precision, creating a picture with carefully selected details, leaving the rest in shadow. She spoke of the relentless tide of wounded men, the desperate struggle to keep infection at bay with nothing but boiling water and whiskey. She told him a story of a young private from Ohio who'd lost a leg but kept the camp entertained by teaching a crow to steal biscuits. She spoke of the exhaustion, the sorrow, the strange, dark humor that blossomed in the midst of horror. She gave him pieces of her past, but never the map that would lead him to her. Her story seemed to unlock a door in him. One night, as the fire burned low and the wind moaned around the eaves, he began to speak. His voice was low, rough with a pain that time had not healed. He spoke of his younger brother, Samuel. "He was the good one," Eli said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Believed in it all. The Union, the glory, the cause. He signed up the first week. Couldn't wait to go. Eli's own enlistment had been different. A reluctant duty done to protect his hot-headed younger brother. Sam saw heroes, I just saw boys. Terrified boys being sent to a slaughterhouse. He described their last battle together. A chaotic, bloody skirmish in a nameless forest. Samuel had charged ahead, full of righteous fire. Eli had been ordered to hold a position, but when the line broke, he had fallen back. He called it a retreat. The word he used in the darkness of his own mind was *fled*. By the time he found his brother again, it was too late. Samuel was lying in the mud, a look of profound surprise on his young face, his lifeblood seeping into the cold Virginia earth. "He died for something," Eli whispered, the words ragged. "And I just ran. I took a ball in the chest a week later, and that was the end of my war. I survived because I was a coward. He died because he was brave." Clara listened, her heart aching with a sorrow that was both fresh and ancient. She saw now that the fortress Eli had built around himself wasn't made of anger, but of guilt. He was a man haunted by the ghost of the hero he believed he should have been. The scar on his face was nothing compared to the wound he carried inside. A few nights later, a new scent filled the cabin, overriding the usual smells of wood smoke and dust. Clara was at the stove, stirring a large pot. She had found a snare with a rabbit that morning, and had spent the afternoon gathering what few hardy herbs and roots she could find near the cabin. The dish she was making was a gamble, a dangerous tug on the thread of a shared past. It was a rich rabbit stew, seasoned with wild thyme and winter onions, the exact meal the delirious young soldier in her tent had babbled about, describing in loving detail the way his mother used to make it back home. Eli came in from the barn, stamping the last of the snow from his boots. He stopped just inside the door, his head lifting like a wolf scenting the air. A look of deep, primal confusion crossed his face. The aroma was more than just food. It was a memory, dredged up from the deepest, most fortified part of his mind. He sat at the table in silence as she ladled a steaming bowl for him. He picked up his spoon, still watching her with a strange, unnerving intensity. He took a bite. The flavor exploded on his tongue. Earthy, savory, familiar. So devastatingly familiar, he froze, his spoon hovering in midair. The taste was a physical jolt, a key turning in a lock he'd long since forgotten. He was transported back to a haze of pain and fever, the taste of this very stew on his tongue, a gentle hand on his brow. It was a memory fragment, hazy and disconnected, but it was there. He looked up at Clara. His eyes narrowed. "Where did you learn to make this?" he asked, his voice tight. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs, but she kept her expression placid. "It's just an old country recipe," she said, her voice even. "A lot of folks cook with what the land gives them. It's nothing special." He continued to stare at her, the cogs of his memory grinding, trying to fit the pieces together. The stew, her competence with wounds, the quiet strength in her hands. It didn't add up. He said nothing more, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. He ate the rest of his stew in a brooding silence, a man trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know he'd been given. The following evening, the sunset was a spectacle of impossible color, bleeding crimson and gold across the snow-covered hills. The beauty of it was so vast and profound it felt like an ache in the chest. Clara stood on the porch, a worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair coming loose from its pins and whipping around her face in the wind. She wasn't looking at the sunset, but through it, her gaze fixed on a distant point only she could see. She was thinking of Lily, of a life she might have had, a warmth she might have known. Eli watched her from the doorway. He saw the loneliness etched in the line of her shoulders, the sorrow in her faraway gaze, a strange, protective instinct, an emotion he hadn't felt since Samuel's death, rose in him. He turned back inside, took a heavy sheepskin-lined coat from a peg, and stepped out onto the porch. Wordlessly, he draped the coat over her shoulders. It was large and heavy, enveloping her in his scent and a surprising warmth. His hands rested on her shoulders for a moment longer than was necessary, the rough pads of his fingers pressing gently into the fabric. It was the first intentional act of kindness he had ever shown her, the first gentle touch. She turned her head, her startled eyes meeting his. In the dying, ethereal light, the space between them shimmered with unspoken emotion. The wind whistled through the cracks in the logs, the only sound in a world that seemed to be holding its breath. The rigid lines of suspicion and defense that had defined them had dissolved, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, almost as if in a trance, compelled by a force he didn't understand. Eli slowly raised his hand, his calloused, work-worn fingers, so accustomed to the heft of an axe or the cold steel of a rifle, traced a line along her jaw, coming to rest gently against her cheek. Her skin was soft and cold from the wind. The touch was a spark on dry tinder. Clara flinched as if she'd been burned, pulling away from him with a sharp, ragged intake of breath. She turned her face away, hiding in the shadows. "I don't want to be hurt again," she whispered, the words barely audible above the wind, but they struck him with the force of a physical blow. Eli stood frozen, his hand still suspended in the air where her face had been. The warmth of her skin was a phantom sensation on his fingertips. He didn't understand the ghosts that haunted her, the men who had taught her that a man's touch was a threat. He only knew that in reaching for her, he had crossed a line, and she had thrown up a wall he had no idea how to breach. The fragile bridge he had tried to build between them had just crumbled into dust. He dropped his hand, a cold emptiness spreading through his chest, and retreated back into the silence of the cabin, leaving her alone with the sunset and the ghosts. The thaw was a liar. It promised a gentle spring but delivered a landscape of mud and misery, and with the melting of the snow came the return of the world of men. They arrived on a Tuesday, 3 riders cresting the hill, their dark coats a stark intrusion against the pale, washed-out sky. They were not drifters or cowboys. They rode expensive horses and sat in their saddles with an air of ownership, as if the very land they crossed already belonged to them. Clara was scrubbing the porch steps when she saw them. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. These were men like Mr. Abernathy, men whose smiles were thinner than ice over a deep river. She retreated into the cabin, watching through a grimy pane of glass as Eli stepped out to meet them, his posture rigid, his hands empty but resting near the Colt holstered at his hip. The leader was a portly man with a florid face and a silver watch chain gleaming against his waistcoat. He did all the talking, his voice a smooth, oily thing that didn't carry to the cabin, but his condescending gestures did. He swept a hand across the horizon, pointing toward the distant mountains, then back at the dilapidated cabin. It was the gesture of a king describing a hovel. Eli stood like a stone statue, his face impassive, his scarred cheek twitching almost imperceptibly. The conversation was short. Eli gave a single, sharp shake of his head. The portly man's smile vanished. His face hardened, and he leaned forward in his saddle, his words now visibly sharp and venomous. He jabbed a finger toward the barn, then the cabin, his meaning clear. Accidents could happen. A lone man was vulnerable. Finally, the man spat on the ground near Eli's feet, wheeled his horse around, and the 3 of them rode away, leaving a trail of profound menace in the air. Eli came back inside, his face a thundercloud. He didn't look at Clara, but went straight for the whiskey bottle, pouring a measure with a trembling hand and downing it in one fiery gulp. "Who were they?" she asked softly. "Vultures," he bit out, slamming the glass down on the table. "Name's Croft. He's been buying up all the land north of here. Says the railroad's coming through and he's making way for it." "He wants to buy this place?" Eli let out a short, bitter laugh. "He wants to steal it. Offered me pennies on the dollar. Told me I could take the offer or wait for a fire to take it for me." He stared out the window after the departed riders, His eyes narrowed to slits. "I'll see him in hell before he gets a single acre." Clara saw the grim set of his jaw and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She had seen this kind of fight before. It was not one that men like Eli, men who own nothing but their own stubborn pride, tended to win. The poison of the outside world, once introduced, spread quickly. A week later, their supplies running dangerously low. Eli had no choice but to ride into redemption. The town she had fled. He was gone for the entire day, leaving Clara in a state of quiet, humming anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. He returned well after dark, his saddlebags full but his mood blacker than a starless night. He unpacked the supplies in a tense, violent silence, dropping sacks of flour and coffee onto the table with enough force to make the timbers groan. He reeked of whiskey and fury. He didn't tell her what had happened, but she could guess. She pictured him in Abernathy's Mercantile, the same room where she had been cornered and threatened. She imagined the whispers slithering through the air as he stood at the counter. "That's the hermit from up north. Heard he's not so alone this winter. Got himself a stray widow keeping his bed warm." She could feel the stares, the sneers, the crude, insinuating jokes. The town that had judged and condemned her for her past was now judging and condemning him for his present, for the simple act of giving her shelter. Her presence was a stain, and it was spreading to him. She began to see herself as a disease, a walking misfortune. She had brought her bad luck, her tarnished reputation, to the one place she had found a fragile peace. The threats from Croft, the scorn of the town, it was all her fault. The weight of it was a physical thing, pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She watched Eli move about the cabin, his face a mask of stone, and saw the deep lines of worry and anger her presence had carved there. She knew, with a certainty that felt like a shard of glass in her heart, that she had to leave. To stay would be to watch him lose everything, just as she had. The decision, once made, was a cold, bitter relief. That night, she waited until his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. A storm was gathering outside, the wind beginning to moan, a fitting eulogy for the hope she was about to abandon. By the dying orange glow of the embers in the hearth, she began to pack. There was little to take: the spare dress, her mother's locket, the unfinished letter to her daughter. She folded each item with a reverent slowness, her movements stiff with unshed tears. She was wrapping a piece of bread and dried meat in a cloth when a floorboard creaked behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble in the darkness. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing by his bunk, a looming shadow, his eyes glinting in the faint light. "I'm leaving, Eli," she said, her own voice a choked whisper. "Leaving?" He took a step closer, his voice rising with a raw, incredulous anger. "In the middle of the night? Into a storm? Have you lost your mind?" "I can't stay here," she said, clutching her small satchel to her chest like a shield. "I'm bringing you nothing but trouble. Croft, the town, you'll lose this place because of me." "So you run," he sneered, the word dripping with contempt. "That's your answer to everything, isn't it? When things get hard, you just run away." His accusation struck a raw nerve. "I am not running away," she shot back, her voice trembling with a sudden, fierce anger. "I am trying to protect you, something you are too stubborn and proud to do for yourself." "Protect me?" He let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. "I've been taking care of myself long before you showed up on my doorstep looking half dead. I don't need your protection, and I sure as hell don't need the town's approval. You think I care what those hypocrites and gossips say about me? About you?" "You should," she cried, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "You have a life here, a home. I won't be the reason you lose it. I've seen what happens when people decide you don't belong. They tear you down, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." "Maybe I don't care if it all burns down," he roared, his fists clenched at his sides, his own torment boiling over. He was trapped by Croft, by the town, by the ghost of his brother, and now by this woman who was making him feel things he didn't want to feel. Maybe I'm tired of fighting for a pile of dirt and rock. What do you know about it? You drift in here with your sad stories and your secrets, and you think you know what it is to lose something? It was the final, cruelest blow. To have her own immense, life-shattering losses dismissed as nothing. The dam of her restraint, built over years of pain and silent endurance, finally burst. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, a sound of pure, animal grief. "Asterisk secrets, asterisk!" she shrieked, the word tearing through the charged air. "You want to know my secret? I saved a soldier's life once, a boy, half dead from a Confederate bullet, lying in a swamp of his own blood. I worked for days to keep him from dying. And what was my reward? The town called me a Yankee lover, a traitor. I lost my home, my good name, my own child was taken from me. All because I chose to do the right thing and save a man's life. A man just like you." Eli went absolutely still, the rage draining from his face to be replaced by a sudden, profound shock. Her words struck him not like an accusation, but like a lightning bolt of pure, impossible truth. Every confusing fragment of the past week suddenly slammed into place with blinding clarity. The uncanny flavor of the rabbit stew, a taste from a fever dream. Her sure, steady hands on his ankle after he fell, hands that knew how to heal, the quiet authority in her voice, the sad, knowing look in her eyes that he now realized he had seen before, looking down at him through a haze of pain. The nurse, the angel in the hellish tent, the woman whose name he had never known, but whose face he had never truly forgotten. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. This wasn't just a woman with a similar story. This was Asterisk, the Asterisk woman. This was Asterisk, his Asterisk story. She was the reason he was standing here, breathing, alive. The revelation was too vast, too overwhelming to comprehend. The fortress of guilt and anger he had lived inside for a decade crumbled to dust in a single, heart-stopping instant. His legs gave out, and he stumbled forward, falling to his knees on the rough floorboards in front of her. He reached out, his hand shaking, and took hers. The same calloused, capable hand. He remembered it now, remembered gripping it as if it were his only anchor to life while his blood poured out of him. A sound, raw and broken, was torn from his chest. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with the first tears he had shed since he was a boy. "It was me," he choked out, the words thick with awe and disbelief. "Clara, it was me." He looked up at her, his face a ruin of anguish and wonder. "I'm alive because of you." She stared down at him, her own tears frozen on her cheeks, her mind reeling. She tried to pull her hand back, instinctively retreating from the sheer, terrifying force of his emotion. But he held on, his grip like iron, his eyes pleading, desperate, and shining with a truth that was about to change everything. The confession had unmade the world. The cabin, once a cage of suspicion, had become a sanctuary. The silence, once a weapon, was now a shared language. The man who had been a scarred, hostile stranger was now Eli, the boy she had saved, the man whose life was inextricably, impossibly, bound to her own. They did not speak of it again in the days that followed. The truth was too vast, too raw to be examined directly. Instead, they spoke through work. The melting snow revealed a season's worth of damage, and they moved to repair it with a silent, synchronized purpose. The fence line along the northern pasture had been crushed by the weight of the drifts. They spent their days under a pale, watery sun, resetting the posts and stretching the wire. Eli would dig the post holes, his powerful shoulders bunching and releasing, the rhythmic thud of the digger a steady heartbeat against the land. Clara would follow behind him, tamping the earth around the new posts, her movements efficient and strong. They worked as a unit, each anticipating the other's needs. He would hand her a hammer without her asking. She would have the staples ready before he turned for them. In the easy rhythm of shared labor, they became something new. They were no longer a man and a woman trapped by a storm, but partners against the relentless demands of the land. In these quiet, shared hours, the last of his defenses crumbled. He began to talk, not in the ragged, whiskey-fueled confessions of the night, but in the slow, measured tones of a man mapping his own soul for the first time. "My father was a hard man," he said one afternoon, his eyes on the distant mountains. He saw any feeling as a weakness, crying, laughing too loud. It was all foolishness to him. Samuel, he could get away with it. He had a light in him. But me, I learned to be quiet, to be hard. I thought that's what it meant to be a man. He looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all its former hostility. "After the war, after Sam, I didn't think I deserved anything good. Not a home, not peace, certainly not a woman. I figured I was meant to be alone with my ghosts. It was my penance for surviving when he didn't." He paused, testing the weight of the hammer in his hand. "Then you showed up, and I fought it. I fought you, but you didn't break. You just were, and you started fixing things. The floor, my clothes, the damn chicken coop." He let out a short, self-deprecating breath. "I've never known anyone like you. Clara, you make me think that maybe a man can be broken and still be worth something. Maybe he can start again." His words were a balm on wounds she hadn't known were still bleeding. He was seeing her, not a widow, not a fallen woman, not a Yankee nurse, but Clara. And in his confession, she felt the first stirrings of a dangerous, terrifying hope. That hope, however, could not erase the past. The ghosts were not his alone. One night, the wind rose again, a mournful, shrieking thing that clawed at the cabin and rattled the window panes. The sound burrowed into Clara's sleep, twisting itself into the shape of a familiar terror. She was back in the storeroom of the Mercantile, the air thick and cloying with the smell of pickles and pipe tobacco. Mr. Abernathy was there, his face bloated and red, his sour breath on her cheek. He was laughing, a low, guttural sound, and the laughter was echoed by the sneering faces of the townswomen, their voices calling her a harlot, a disgrace. A rough hand grabbed her arm, its grip like iron, and she began to struggle, a scream trapped in her throat, a silent, desperate thrashing against a fate she had only narrowly escaped. She awoke to a different hand, a different voice. "Clara, wake up! You're dreaming!" Eli was kneeling beside her pallet on the floor, his hands gripping her thrashing arms to keep her from hurting herself. The room was pitch black save for the faint, hellish glow of the embers in the hearth. His face, inches from hers, was a mask of alarm and concern. The dream shattered, but the terror remained. A cold, slick poison in her veins. She stared at him, her chest heaving, a wild, cornered look in her eyes. The scream that had been trapped in her throat finally broke free, a ragged, heartbroken sob. And then she did something that surprised them both. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck, and clung to him, burying her face in the rough fabric of his nightshirt. Her body was racked with violent, uncontrollable tremors. Eli froze, every muscle in his body going rigid with shock and uncertainty. He was a man of solitude, unaccustomed to any touch, let alone this desperate, frantic embrace. He awkwardly brought his arms up, his large, calloused hands hovering uncertainly over her back before finally coming to rest. One on her trembling shoulders, the other on the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her loose hair. He held her, clumsy but firm, a living anchor in the storm of her fear. "It was just a dream," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You're safe." "He was going to hurt me," she wept, the words muffled against his chest. "He said I owed him, because I was a widow, alone. He said no one would believe me, and they wouldn't have. They never do." the pieces of her fragmented story, the flight from town, the fear in her eyes, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the war or the loss of her child that haunted her. It was something more recent, more personal. A man had threatened her, had tried to claim her as his right, and the town had already judged her guilty. Eli's awkwardness was burned away by a sudden, white-hot surge of protective fury. He thought of Croft, of Abernathy, of every man who looked at a woman's hardship and saw only an opportunity. He tightened his hold on her, no longer hesitant, his embrace now a shield. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him in the dim, flickering light. Her face was awash with tears, her eyes wide with a pain and humiliation that tore at his soul. "I believe you," he said, his voice thick with an unfamiliar emotion. "Clara, whatever happened, whatever they said, I believe you." Those 3 words were the most profound kindness she had ever known. They were the validation she had been denied her entire life. They were a gift, a miracle in the dark. The sobbing subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh. The storm inside her had finally broken. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the floor in the near darkness, the only sound the dying wind and the beating of their own hearts. She slowly pulled back, her hands still resting on his shoulders. He didn't let her go. His hands framed her face, his thumbs gently wiping the last of the tears from her cheeks. They looked at each other, and the air in the small space grew thick, charged with a new and terrifying electricity. All the secrets were out, all the walls were down. There was nothing left between them but 2 broken, lonely souls, clinging to each other in the dark. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of conquest. It was a kiss of profound, trembling uncertainty. His lips were chapped and tentative against hers, a question asked in a language neither of them was fluent in. She responded with a soft, yielding pressure, an answer that was both a surrender and a discovery. It was slow and gentle and hesitant and utterly unstoppable. It was the taste of wood smoke and whiskey, of salt from her tears, of a loneliness so deep it had become a part of them. And in that kiss, that loneliness began, finally, to recede. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her lips. She looked into his eyes and saw not a hardened hermit, but a man drowning in a feeling he could not name, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like the most courageous act of her life. She reached for the buttons of her nightdress. Her fingers were shaking. She didn't undo them. Instead, she pushed the worn fabric aside, baring her shoulder. In the faint firelight, he could see them, the faded yellow and purple shadows of old bruises on her skin. Ghosts of a past shame. Her final secret. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He looked from the marks on her skin to the vulnerability in her eyes, and with a reverence that felt like a prayer, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to the bruised skin. He kissed each mark, not with passion, but with a gentle, healing tenderness, as if his touch could erase not the mark itself, but the memory of the humiliation that had put it there. A soft, broken sound escaped her lips. This was an intimacy more profound than any she had ever known. He was not just seeing her body. He was seeing her wounds, and he was not turning away. He was honoring them. That reverence, that acceptance, broke the last of her fear. The kiss that followed was different. It was no longer tentative. It was a desperate mutual need, an urgent seeking of solace, of life, of affirmation in the face of a cruel world. Their clothes became a hindrance, shed with a frantic haste, until there was nothing between them but skin and scars and the desperate, aching need to be whole. That night, on a pallet of furs before a dying fire, 2 people who had been resurrected from the brink of death found a new kind of life in each other. It began with the desperate, grasping urgency of the nearly drowned, a frantic affirmation that they were still alive, still able to feel. But as the night deepened, That urgency softened, melting into a slow, gentle rhythm, a rediscovery of tenderness. It was not the taking of one body by another, but the careful, reverent mapping of two landscapes of pain and the discovery of a shared and sacred ground. It was the quiet, miraculous rebirth of two souls who had long ago given up on the idea of spring. The dawn broke cold and gray, leaching the warmth and magic from the night that had preceded it. In the stark morning light, the intimacy they had shared felt like a fever dream, a dangerous and reckless illusion. Clara awoke first. Her body nestled against Eli's warmth, the heavy weight of his arm draped possessively over her waist. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, she felt a sense of peace so profound it was painful. Then, memory returned, and with it, a cold, creeping dread. She saw their clothes, discarded in a heap by the hearth. She saw the disheveled pallet of furs, a testament to their shared, frantic passion, and she saw it all through the eyes of the world she had fled. The whispers of the townswomen in redemption became a roar in her mind. Asterisk harlot, loose woman, easy. She had proven them right, in a single night of weakness, of desperate, soul-deep need. She had become the very thing they accused her of being. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She carefully, silently, slipped out from under Eli's arm. He stirred, murmuring something in his sleep, but didn't wake. She moved about the cabin like a ghost, dressing quickly in the semi-darkness, her movements jerky and panicked. She stoked the fire, fetched water, started the coffee, building a wall of mundane chores between the woman she had been in the night and the woman she had to be in the day. Shame was a physical thing, a sour taste in her mouth, a heavy cloak on her shoulders. She was terrified that when Eli awoke, he would look at her with contempt, that the tenderness of the night would curdle into morning after regret. When he finally did wake, he found her with her back to him, scrubbing a pot with a furious, focused energy. He rose from the furs, a slow smile touching his lips, a new and unfamiliar lightness in his chest. The world felt different this morning. It felt possible. "Clara," he said, his voice soft, still thick with sleep. She flinched, her shoulders going rigid. She did not turn around. "The coffee is ready," she said, her voice flat and distant. The lightness in his chest vanished, replaced by a cold confusion. He walked up behind her, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Clara, what is it?" She jerked away from his touch as if she'd been burned. "Don't," she whispered, her voice tight. He stood there, his hand suspended in the air, utterly bewildered. He was a stranger in this new territory of the heart. He didn't understand the delicate, brutal politics of shame and reputation that governed a woman's world. He only knew that the woman he had held, the woman who had resurrected him, was now treating him like a threat. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice clumsy with a hurt he didn't know how to express. "We did something wrong," she corrected, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were shadowed, her face pale and drawn. "Last night was a mistake. Eli, a moment of weakness. It can't happen again." Each word was a blow. He stared at her, trying to reconcile this cold, distant woman with the passionate, vulnerable one from his arms. He saw the fear in her eyes and mistook it for regret, for rejection. A part of him, the old, wounded part, wanted to retreat, to throw his own walls back up. But another, newer part, the part she had awakened, refused. He spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet torment, watching her move through the cabin, a stranger once more. He chopped firewood with a savage intensity, the axe splitting logs with the force of his own confusion and fear. He wrestled with a torrent of feelings he couldn't name, a fierce, roaring protectiveness, a tenderness that felt like an open wound, and a terrifying fear of losing her now that he had just found her. And through this emotional tempest, a single, stark, and terrifying idea began to form. It was the only solution his practical, unromantic mind could conjure, the only way a man of his time and place knew how to make a claim, to offer protection, to turn a mistake into a sacred, unbreakable vow. Marriage. The word itself felt foreign on his tongue, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to ask. He was just terrified she would say no. His chance to ask was stolen from him. In the late afternoon, a lone rider appeared, approaching not with the swagger of Croft's men, but with the slow, deliberate pace of the law. He wore a dusty hat and a tin star pinned to his vest. Eli met him on the porch, Clara a silent, anxious presence in the doorway behind him. "Eli Stone?" the deputy asked, his eyes hard and appraising. He glanced past Eli to Clara, his gaze lingering on her with a casual insolence that made Eli's hands curl into fists. "I'm Miller, deputy out of Redemption," the man continued. "Got a complaint I need to look into." "What kind of complaint?" Eli's voice was flat, devoid of warmth. Miller's eyes slid back to Clara, a smug, knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Word is you're harboring a woman of questionable character. More than that, got a wire from a town back east. Says a woman matching her description is wanted for questioning. Something about being a traitor during the war, aiding the enemy." The accusation hung in the cold air, venomous and absurd. This, then, was Croft's doing. He had dug into her past, found the old ugly lies, and twisted them into a weapon to use against them both. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was happening all over again. The past she could never outrun had finally caught her. The deputy swung down from his horse, his eyes still fixed on Clara with a look of open contempt. He took in her worn dress, her tired face, and the clear intimacy of her presence in Eli's cabin. "So," Miller sneered, his voice loud enough for the whole valley to hear. "This the little harlot you're shacked up with? Stone? Must be worth the trouble if she's got you hiding a traitor from the law." The world seemed to slow down. Eli didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. He moved with a speed and violence that was terrifying in its efficiency. He took 2 steps forward and drove his right fist into Deputy Miller's jaw. The crack of bone on bone echoed in the still air. Miller's head snapped back, his eyes rolling up, and he crumpled to the ground in a heap, unconscious before he even landed. Clara screamed, a sharp, terrified sound. She rushed forward as Eli stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, his knuckles already swelling and bloody. "Eli, no!" she cried. Grabbing his arm, he shook his head, the red mist of rage slowly clearing from his eyes as he looked at what he'd done. He had protected her honor, but in doing so, he had just declared war on the law itself. Miller came to a few minutes later, groaning and spitting blood. He staggered to his feet, one hand holding his jaw, his eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and pure hatred. "You're a dead man. Stone," he spat, his words slurred. "Assaulting an officer of the law, harboring a fugitive. I'll have a posse here by the week's end that'll burn this place to the ground and haul you both off in chains." He stumbled back to his horse, pulling himself into the saddle with a pained grunt. "But I'll give you a chance. You and your whore have 10 days to be out of this county. If I see either of you after that, I'll shoot you on sight." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving a ringing, terrible silence in his wake. The future had just been erased. They were outlaws, exiles. Clara stared at the spot where the deputy had fallen, her body numb with shock. It was over. Her presence had finally and completely destroyed him. She turned to him, her face a mask of quiet despair. "I have to go," she said, her voice hollow. "Now, alone. He's after me. Eli, not you. If I'm gone, maybe he'll leave you be." "No," Eli said, his voice raw. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip gentle but firm, forcing her to look at him. "No, we're not separating. Not now." "You don't have a choice," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "Look what I've done. I've made you an outcast. I've cost you your home." "This isn't a home without you," he roared, his own desperation finally breaking through. "It's just a shell, a place I came to die. You taught me how to live again. Clara, I'm not letting you go." He saw only one way forward, one final, desperate gamble to bind them together, to give them a future, however uncertain. All his fear, all his hesitation, was burned away by the imminent threat of losing her. He dropped his hands from her shoulders and, to her utter shock, sank to one knee before her on the dusty porch. He took her trembling hand in his own bloody, calloused one. "Don't leave me," he pleaded, his voice cracking, all his pride gone, his soul laid bare. "Marry me, Clara, right now. Be my wife. We'll leave this cursed place together. We'll go west, north, anywhere. We can find a new place, a new life. Just say you'll be my wife. Please." His proposal, so raw and heartfelt, was the most beautiful and painful thing she had ever heard. Tears streamed down her face, not tears of joy, but of a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing her apart. He was offering her everything she had ever dreamed of: a name, a home, a future with the only man who had ever believed in her. And because she loved him, with a fierce, protective love that eclipsed everything else, she had to refuse. She knelt down in front of him, taking his face in her hands. She looked into his desperate, hopeful eyes and prepared to break his heart. "Eli," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Look at me. I am a woman with no name, no honor. The law thinks I'm a traitor. The world thinks I'm a whore. If you marry me, that becomes your name too. You will be the man married to the traitor. Everywhere we go, my past will follow us and pull you down. I love you too much to do that to you." She leaned in and pressed a gentle, heartbreaking kiss to his lips. "I can't ruin you, Eli," she whispered against his mouth. "I won't." She left at dawn. A cold, relentless drizzle was falling from a bruised gray sky, a quiet weeping that seemed to mourn the death of the fragile hope they had shared. She did not pack much. There was little to pack. She simply pulled her worn shawl over her head, opened the cabin door, and stepped out into the rain. She did not look back. To look back would be to see him, to see the life she was choosing to abandon for his sake. And her resolve, as brittle as winter ice, would have shattered. Every step away from the cabin was an act of physical and spiritual agony. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to hold her back, to pull her down. With each footfall, she felt the invisible thread connecting her to him stretch and fray, threatening to snap and leave her utterly adrift. She was a walking ghost, leaving the only place she had ever felt truly seen, the only man who had ever made her feel safe. The rain washed the world clean, erasing her tracks, erasing her presence, until it was as if she had never been there at all. Eli awoke to a silence that was deeper and more profound than any he had ever known. The cabin was cold. The fire in the hearth was dead, a pile of gray ash. Her pallet of furs was empty, neatly folded. He knew before he even looked. She was gone. He stood in the center of the room, a hollowed-out man in a hollowed-out home. The rain pattered against the roof, a soft, mocking drumbeat counting out the seconds of his new, empty life. For a long time, he did nothing. He didn't curse. He didn't weep. He simply stood there as the full, crushing weight of her absence settled over him. She had left to save him, but her leaving was a wound far deeper than any Confederate bullet. She had torn the heart out of him and taken it with her. The days that followed were a blur of mindless, punishing labor. He tried to live as he had before she came, to fall back into the hard, solitary rhythms of his old life. He chopped wood until his muscles screamed and his hands were blistered, seeking exhaustion as a drug against thought. He repaired the fences, his movements mechanical, his eyes seeing not the wire and posts, but her face, her hands, her smile. He ate standing up, tasteless food that he barely chewed, but the ghost of her was everywhere. He heard her voice in the sigh of the wind. He smelled her scent, of lye soap and wild herbs, lingering in the rough-spun blankets. The cabin, once his fortress, was now his prison, each corner saturated with a memory of her. He had been alone before, but he had never, ever been this lonely. The fire started on the 5th day. The rain had stopped, replaced by a strange, dry wind that blew in from the east, hot and restless. It was a devil wind, sucking the moisture from the land, leaving the pine forests that covered the hills as dry as tinder. No one knew how it began. A stray spark from a homesteader's chimney, a lightning strike in the high country. It didn't matter. By midday, a plume of greasy, yellow-brown smoke was visible on the horizon, and the air had taken on a strange, metallic tang. By late afternoon, the smoke was a towering, churning cloud that blotted out the sun, casting the world in an unnatural, apocalyptic orange glow. The wind was a roaring furnace, carrying with it the scent of burning pine and the distant, terrifying sound of a world being consumed. It was like the sound of a freight train, a sound that grew louder and closer with every passing minute. Eli knew he should run. He should gather what water he could, grab his rifle, and head west, toward the river. But his few remaining cattle and his horse, the roan gelding, were in the far pasture, a half-mile east, directly in the path of the oncoming inferno. They were all he had left of his old life, the last tangible pieces of his world. In a haze of grief and reckless despair, he made a decision born not of logic, but of a broken heart. He would not lose anything else. He grabbed a wet burlap sack and ran, not away from the fire, but toward it. Clara had made it 20 miles south, finding temporary work mending clothes for a blacksmith's wife in a tiny, nameless settlement. Every hour was a torment, a battle against the overwhelming urge to turn back. That afternoon, she was outside, taking down a line of washing. When she saw the smoke, her heart seized with a primal, inexplicable fear. It was in the direction of Eli's land. Her fear became a reality an hour later when a young boy on a lathered pony galloped into the settlement, his eyes wide with panic. "Fire!" he yelled to the small crowd that gathered. "A big one, coming down from the North Ridge. It's already crossed the creek." Clara grabbed the boy's bridle, her knuckles white. "The North Ridge. Is it near the old stone ranch, the one-man place?" The boy nodded, his chest heaving. "It's right in its path. Old Man Stone's a goner if he's still there." The world dissolved into a single, roaring point of focus. Asterisk Eli asterisk. All her reasons for leaving, all her fears of ruining him, turned to ash. What was a ruined reputation compared to a body burned beyond recognition? What was a life of shame compared to no life at all? She didn't think. She acted. She threw a few coins at the stunned blacksmith's wife, ran to the small livery, and used the last of her money to buy the oldest, sway-backed mare they had. She didn't care. It was a horse, and it would run north. She mounted the animal and dug her heels in, racing back the way she had come, toward the pillar of smoke and the man she refused to let die. The world she rode into was a Bosch painting of hell. The air was thin and hot, thick with smoke that stung her eyes and clawed at her throat. Ash, like black snow, rained down from the sky. The roar of the fire was a physical presence, a deafening, all-consuming god. She pushed the terrified horse through a landscape of glowing embers and fleeing, panic-stricken animals. She found his cabin miraculously untouched, sitting in a small clearing that the fire had, for the moment, leaped over. But the barn and the pastures beyond were a different story. The barn was already engulfed, flames licking up its sides, a torrent of black smoke pouring from its roof, and stumbling out of that smoke, his face black with soot, his body weaving with exhaustion and lack of oxygen, was Eli. He was trying to lead the roan, but the horse, wild-eyed with terror, was pulling against him. A heavy, burning timber crashed down from the barn roof, landing between them and the path to safety, showering them in sparks. The horse screamed, reared, and bolted directly into the woods. Eli, caught off guard, was thrown to the ground, his head hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening crack. He lay still, directly in the path of the collapsing, flaming structure. Clara leaped from her mare, her mind a bubble of cold, clear calm in the inferno. She saw the rain barrel by the side of the cabin, still half full. She ran to it, plunged her heavy wool cloak into the water until it was saturated, then ran toward the barn, pulling the heavy, steaming cloak over her head and shoulders. The heat was a physical blow, so intense it felt like it was melting her skin. She ignored it. She reached Eli, the air around them shimmering, the roar of the flames in her ears. He was unconscious. She grabbed him under the arms, her feet slipping in the mud and ash, and began to drag him. He was a dead weight, and she was not a strong woman, but adrenaline and love gave her the strength of 10. She pulled, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning, dragging him inch by agonizing inch away from the collapsing barn, away from the wall of fire. Just as they cleared the worst of it, the barn roof fell in with a deafening roar, sending a great mushroom cloud of flame and embers into the sky. At that exact moment, as if in response to a prayer, the sky opened up. The rain began to fall, not a drizzle, but a torrential, hissing downpour. She collapsed beside him, her body shaking, her lungs raw, as the rain plastered her hair to her ash-streaked face. She pulled his head onto her lap, her hands frantically checking for a pulse. She found it, faint but steady. He was alive. He came to a few moments later, his head throbbing, his mind a confused fog of smoke and noise. The first thing he saw, through slitted, smoke-stung eyes, was her face. She was a vision from a fever dream, her skin smeared with soot, her hair a wet, tangled mess, her eyes clear and fierce, staring down at him, shining with tears. She was holding him, her arms wrapped around his chest as if she would never let go. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He swallowed, the rain cool on his parched lips. "Don't ever," he rasped, his voice a broken thing. "Tell me to leave again." She let out a choked sob that was half laugh, half wail, and lowered her head until her forehead rested against his. "I won't," she whispered. And there, in the pouring rain, surrounded by the hiss of water on hot ash and the red, angry glow of the dying fire, he pulled her face to his and kissed her. It was a kiss of soot and rain and desperation, a kiss that tasted of smoke and survival. It was a promise sealed in the heart of the inferno, a reclamation of a love that had refused to burn. They were not alone. Drawn by the smoke, a small group of ranchers and townsfolk, a nascent fire brigade, had arrived on the ridge. They had come to watch a hermit's homestead burn. Instead, they stood in silence, watching something else entirely. They saw the woman they had scorned as a harlot, covered in ash, pulling the man they had dismissed as a coward from the flames. They saw a deserter and a fallen woman, two outcasts, clinging to each other in the ruins, their love a fierce, defiant light in the devastation. No one sneered, no one whispered. In the face of a courage so raw and a love so undeniable, there was nothing left to say. One by one, the men silently, respectfully, took off their hats. Spring did not arrive that year. It was born from the ash, where the fire had scorched the earth black. A vibrant, almost violent green erupted, a testament to the land's stubborn refusal to die. The blackened skeletons of pine trees on the ridge stood as monuments to the devastation, but in the valley, life was returning with a fierce and determined beauty. The fire had changed everything. It had not just destroyed a barn, it had burned away the last vestiges of their old lives. It had incinerated the town's judgment, the deputy's threats, and Eli's self-imposed exile. In its wake, something new and clean had been left behind. The ranchers and townsfolk who had witnessed Clara's courage and Eli's devotion no longer saw them as outcasts. They saw two survivors, two people bound by something stronger than law or rumor. Croft and his railroad ambitions quietly vanished, his threats powerless against a community that had, in a single, dramatic afternoon, decided to claim the hermit and the widow as their own. They rebuilt, not with the grim necessity of survival, but with the quiet joy of creation. A group of men from the valley, led by a rancher whose own homestead had been saved by a change in the wind, arrived one morning with a wagon full of fresh-cut lumber. They did not ask for payment. They worked alongside Eli, and by the end of the week, the frame of a new, stronger barn stood against the sky. They worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by the rhythmic rasp of saws and the clean, satisfying thud of hammers. Eli and Clara painted the cabin. They mixed whitewash in a bucket, the pale color a startling contrast to the dark, weathered logs. As they worked side by side, their brushes moving in a steady rhythm, they were washing away the years of dust and gloom, of solitude and sorrow. When they were done, the cabin no longer looked like a hermit's hovel. It shone in the spring sun, bright and hopeful. It looked like a home. They planted a garden in the rich, fire-fertilized soil. He would turn the earth with a spade, his back strong and steady, and she would follow, pressing the small seeds into the dark, damp soil. They planted beans and squash, corn and tomatoes, their hands moving together, their actions a silent promise of a future, of a harvest they would share. They lived as husband and wife. There had been no preacher, no piece of paper to make it so. Their vows had been exchanged in the heart of a wildfire, their union consecrated by ash and rain. Their love was not a thing to be sanctioned by the outside world. It was a wild, resilient thing that had grown in the most barren of soils. It was in the easy way he would reach for her hand as they sat on the porch in the evening, in the way she would lean her head against his shoulder, their silence more intimate than any words. It was in the shared glance across the dinner table, the quiet laughter that now filled the small, bright cabin. They were two halves of a whole, their jagged, broken edges fitting together so perfectly that it was impossible to imagine they had ever been apart. One afternoon in late summer, as the heat shimmered over the green fields, they saw a wagon approaching. It was not a farmer's cart or a supply wagon from town. It was a small, covered passenger wagon, and it stopped at the end of their lane. A young woman descended. She was tall and slender, with dark, wavy hair pulled back from a face that was a pale, perfect oval. She stood for a long moment, her hand shielding her eyes as she looked toward the shining white cabin, a look of profound uncertainty on her face. She was perhaps 16 years old. Clara was on the porch, mending one of Eli's shirts. The needle slipped from her fingers, clattering unheard onto the wooden boards. Her breath caught in her chest. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Time seemed to slow, to stretch, to hold its breath. It was a face she had only seen in her dreams, a face she had last seen as a tiny, sleeping infant. "Lily," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. The young woman heard her, or perhaps she simply saw the look on Clara's face. She began to walk, then run, her skirts flying, her steps clumsy with an urgency that mirrored the frantic beating of Clara's heart. Clara rose, her legs trembling, and met her at the bottom of the porch steps. They stopped a foot apart, two strangers bound by the most sacred tie on earth. The girl's eyes, a deep, clear blue, searched Clara's face, taking in the lines of hardship, the flecks of gray in her hair, the overwhelming, soul-deep love that was pouring from her. They told me you left me," the girl said, her voice trembling. "But I found your letters, the ones you sent that they never gave me. I found them last month, hidden in a box." A sob broke from Clara's throat. "I never wanted to leave you, never for a single day." The girl's face crumpled, the years of confusion and abandonment melting away, leaving only the simple, profound need of a child for her mother. "Mother?" she asked, the word a question, a plea, a prayer. "Oh, my sweet girl," Clara wept, and then they were in each other's arms, clinging together, the 10 years of stolen time and forced separation dissolving in a torrent of tears. Eli had been coming from the new barn, a leather harness in his hand. He stopped, a silent witness to the scene. He saw the years of Clara's secret, silent grief made real. He saw the missing piece of her soul, the source of the sorrow he had sometimes seen in her eyes, restored to her. He felt not a flicker of jealousy or resentment, only a wave of love for her so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. As their weeping subsided, Clara finally pulled back, her hands framing her daughter's face, her eyes drinking in every detail. She turned, her arm still wrapped tightly around the girl's waist, and looked at Eli. There was no fear in her eyes, no apology, only love.
"Eli,"
she said, her voice thick but clear.
"this is my daughter. Lily, Lily, this is Eli. He's the man who saved me."
Lily looked at the big, scarred man who stood so quietly, watching them with such tenderness in his winter sky eyes. She saw the strength in him, the quiet goodness. She saw the way he looked at her mother, and she understood everything. Eli dropped the harness. He walked toward them and did not stop until he had wrapped his arms around both of them, pulling them into a fierce, protective embrace. He was no longer just a man who had been saved. In that moment, he became a husband. He became a father. He became the anchor for this small, battered family he had never known he wanted. He held them close, his cheek resting against Clara's hair, and for the first time in his life, his past was silent. He was home. A week later, another rider came. This one was an official-looking man in a suit, a mail courier. He carried a letter bearing an official government seal. It was addressed to Mrs. Clara Thompson. With trembling hands, Clara broke the seal, Eli and Lily watching over her shoulder. It was from the War Department. It stated that, due to the recent sworn testimony of a retired Union Army surgeon, a doctor, Alistair Finch, the charges of treason leveled against her had been officially investigated and dismissed. Dr. Finch, who had been her superior, had testified that Nurse Thompson had, at great personal risk, saved the lives of no fewer than 50 Union soldiers, and that her aid to a handful of wounded Confederate prisoners was an act of medical mercy, not treason, and was in keeping with the highest ideals of her profession. Her name was cleared. Her honor was restored. That evening, as the sun set, painting the hills in shades of rose and gold, Clara stood in the open doorway of the cabin, looking out over the land. It was so green, so peaceful. The scars of the fire were still there, but they no longer looked like wounds. They looked like part of the story, part of what made the landscape beautiful and whole. Eli came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her cheek. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky. "You know," he said finally, his voice a low, soft rumble against her back. "The first time you saved me, it was with your hands." He felt her smile. "This time," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he tightened his embrace, "it was with your heart." Clara leaned her head back against his shoulder and turned her face to kiss his scarred cheek. She looked back out at the vast, beautiful, and forgiving land that was now their home, at the endless future that stretched out before them. "And I'm not done saving you yet," she said softly. "Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West Campfire. We love hearing from our posse around the world, so let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and feel free to share your thoughts. We'll be waiting for you at the next campfire.